Well, okay, welcome everyone. We're so happy to have you for the opening reception for the Age of Armor, Treasures from the Higgins Armory at the Worcester Art Museum. And our speaker tonight, Dr. Jeffrey L. Forgeng, who is the Higgins Curator of Arms and Armor and Medieval Art at the Worcester Art Museum. We're delighted to have you here tonight. I wanted to thank our sponsors for the exhibition, Investment for the Age of Armor, Treasures from the Higgins Armory Collection at the Worcester Art Museum is provided by the City of Savannah and the Georgia Council for the Arts. Major exhibition funding for our 5-year exhibition plan is provided by the Little John Family Foundation. We're very grateful for that long-term support for our vision. This is the first installation of our marquee annual exhibitions, and so we're so pleased to have that started up and grateful for the support of the Little Johns. Thank you. Exhibition support is also provided by Inga Brossler and Mr. and Mrs. Robert S. Jepson Jr. and Dr. and Mrs. William T. Moore, Ted Moore and Linda. So thank you for their special support. We're always grateful for the support of our Directors Circle Council members who support our annual exhibition program year-round. I wanted to especially give a round of thanks and praise for Dr. Elise Gerstenecker, who is our Curator of Decorative Arts, who is the lead organizing and presenting curator of the show here at Telfair. I think you'll all agree, but form your own opinions, that it is an incredible installation and display. Elise was joined by many talented colleagues, including our Chief Registrar, Jen Levy, who's here tonight. Yay, Jen. Assistant Curator Anne-Céline Bayan, who's also here. Our very talented Chief Preparator, Heath Rich, and Preparator Andrew Gotti as well. And our Head of Design, Melissa Hill, who's such an incredible talent, and she makes everything that we do at Telfair better every day, so thank you to Melissa. Of course, our development department as well, who raised wonderful special support for this exhibition, led by Raina Edgar, and the whole team really pitched in. So this is a team effort. It's a great example of Telfair's collaborative working style and working environment, and I think the results will really show through when you have a chance to go to see the exhibition in a few minutes, if many of you have already seen it. So our speaker tonight, Jeffrey L. Forgeng, is the Higgins Curator of Arms and Armor and Medieval Art at the Worcester Art Museum. How many of you have been to Worcester? Yeah, okay. Great. Well, this will be just another reason to go back. Jeffrey is working on a permanent galleries for the display of this really premier collection of historical armor in the country. So that'll be an exciting thing to see how that evolves as well. He has been responsible for the Higgins collection since 1999. His nationally touring exhibitions have included the Age of Armor, A Double-Edged Weapon, the sword as icon and artifact, and Now Thrive the Armorers, Arms and Armor in Shakespeare, among others. Dr. Forgeng is also the author of over a dozen books and is currently developing the Worcester Art Museum's permanent galleries of arms and armor. So please welcome our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the kind words and the welcome. And also for all the work that the team here has put into the exhibition. They've done a fabulous job. If you haven't seen it yet, you've got a treat ahead of you. You've got clearly a very talented and hardworking team in place, and it's always great to see what every new venue does with the collection. And I'd like to start this evening by posing a question. What does armor mean to you? One of the things that's really, to me, most fascinating about these objects is that 500 years later, they still have tremendous emotive power. They're really one of the most emotionally charged kinds of objects that one might see in a museum. You don't have to know anything about arms and armor to have some kind of a gut response to these objects. They're deeply embedded in our popular culture, in movies, TV, video games, and such. And they really evoke a lot of cultural responses in us. Perhaps one of the things might be a sense of empowerment or of invulnerability that comes with a suit of armor. Perhaps also with the notion of a hero's quest. Perhaps the suit of armor makes you think of a semi-legendary past or a world of adventure and a possibility. Perhaps it brings to mind for you thoughts of noble values of a bygone age. Well, these are objects that obviously for us, they may have these evocative kind of powers, but they're not really part of our actual lived experience in the real world. Back in the days when these things were actually worn, people were actually familiar with these things as practical objects of the real world. But what's particularly interesting to me is that a lot of the kinds of associations with these objects that I've just listed were as present for them 500 years ago when these suits of armor were actually being worn on the battlefield as they are for us today. I think that's one of the most fascinating things about arms and armor, the suits of armor in particular, is that you don't necessarily have to know a lot about the history to get these objects. In a lot of ways, you can kind of, just looking at them, you can kind of get them in a way that they were understood by the people who actually wore, made, used them, and knew them in their working life. And this evening I'm going to try and show you a little bit of both of those sides of the equation, the practical aspects of how armor was used, as well as what it meant to the people who wore them. We tend to associate the suit of armor with the Middle Ages, but in a way that's actually kind of misleading. The suit of plate steel didn't really come into being until the very end of the Middle Ages. And most of the time, if you see a suit of armor, say in a museum, you're seeing something that was made after the Middle Ages were over by pretty much any definition of the chronology. The full suit of plate steel is essentially more of a Renaissance production than a production of the Middle Ages. For most of the Middle Ages, the best-dressed warriors, the best-equipped knights were wearing mail as their protective gear for the body. There's a great example of it in the exhibition, which tells a fascinating story across continents and across the centuries. The heart of this mail coat, which you'll see upstairs, was made in Europe at the very end of the Middle Ages, but it was still in service probably as late as the late 1800s in Sudanic Africa. So for most of the Middle Ages, the protection that a knight wore was some kind of solid helmet of plate steel to protect the head, but the body armor, the armor for the limbs and the legs, was chiefly of mail. It wasn't until late in the Middle Ages, perhaps around the 1200s or thereabouts, that they start adding components of more solid protection into the mix, protecting perhaps chest plates or guards for the knees, for the shins, other vulnerable parts of the body. And by the 1300s, they're starting to put these together into articulated components like the knee plate that you see here that are designed to be shaped and also to move with the form of the human body. A very complex undertaking and an art form that took shape over a long period of time. Early examples like this knee guard that you see here, you'll see it's in the exhibition. It's fairly simple in its shapes, but over the course of the 1400s, armorers are becoming more and more sophisticated with their techniques and with their styling. And by the latter part of the century, they're really exploiting the potential of the medium to create sculptures in steel. And armor is at this point no longer just a practical garment for protection on the battlefield, it becomes wearable sculpture, and it becomes also a manifestation of fashion. You get divergent styles. In Italy, they tend toward a kind of more rounded shapes, imitating particularly the look of the civilian clothing. And there's consistently a connection between civilian clothing and the styling of armor and its silhouette. So you can see a little bit of the similarity between the shape of this breastplate in the exhibition and a gentleman's doublet or jacket of the late 1400s. In Germany, they go for surfaces that are more elaborately worked with rippled effects, elongated lines, sharp angles, cusped points in a style that's been labeled Gothic in comparison to the ribbed surfaces, elongated lines and such that are characteristic of Gothic cathedrals. And most of what we know about actual medieval armor really comes from various kinds of visual sources. Surviving examples of medieval armor are extremely rare. Full suits of actual medieval armor are virtually non-existent. So we're very reliant on things like the sculpture of St. George to give us an idea of what the full ensemble of armor looked like. But as you can see, it was the visual impact was tremendous, and it was very much connected to the aesthetic values of the period. But it was also highly functional. This was an extremely well engineered kind of equipment. It was carefully shaped to follow the complex contours of the human body as well as its complex angles of motion. All of the whole suit started with a padded arming jacket, and everything was kind of layered up on top of that. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen the process of attaching the suit of armor to that underlayer, with bits of mail also included into the mix to cover the gaps. There are certain parts of the body that are extremely difficult to protect with solid plate steel, say the inside of the armpit, inside of the elbow, places like that, interiors of joints where solid plates of steel would make it really difficult to have full freedom of motions. Those are the gaps of the armor, and typically those are the places where you'll see this backup protection of mail. And then the armor is attached on top. All of this done typically with laces called points, essentially equivalent to modern shoelaces. And you'll see in a number of the objects on display, if you look really closely, little pairs of holes. And that's exactly what those holes are there for. That's where the laces went through to tie the armor to its substrate of the padded arming jacket. And one of the things that's particularly cool about this whole story is that you've got this jacket, and you've got various laces that attach to it at various spots to kind of hold the armor in place on the body. Eventually, when armor goes out of use, they're stopping to, they're no longer wearing the armor itself, but the jacket itself, the underlayers, become a fashion statement in its own right. And they also hold on to the laces themselves as well, the laces that hold the armor in place. And to this day, dress uniforms in the military still include things like the laces at the shoulder that held the armor in place is part of the braid that is part of a modern dress uniform today. So the armor is carefully constructed to shape, with the contours of the human body, to move with the human body. You have pretty much full range of motion in a full suit of armor. The one thing you really can't do is lift your arms directly over your head because the shoulder blades get in the way. But given that the armpit is a major target, you don't really want to do that too much anyway. So these guys were actually capable of moving quite freely in their armor. They're highly trained martial artists, relying on their skill that they've been developing with the weapons and fighting on horseback ever since they were children. You're raised to become a knight. It's not a vocation that you choose. It's something that you're born into and that you're bred into from a very young age. So they're really good at what they do, but it's because they've been doing it since they were really just yay high, and their armor is made to allow them to have that full freedom of motion to use that kind of skill. And but you can imagine that wearing a full suit of armor. I mean, the full suit of armor isn't as heavy as we think it is today. Typically 40 to 60 pounds is a common range. Modern soldiers in the field might be carrying upwards of 100 pounds. So it's not, you know, it's not unbearable, but it's a not insignificant amount of extra weight. These guys have to be in good physical shape. They do things like running races, javelin, shot put. A lot of these sort of track and field sports are some of the sorts of things that they do to build up the strength, the stamina and agility that it takes in order to fight in armor. And indeed, to this day, the gymnastic sport of vaulting derives from something that knights used to do in order to build that physical capacity to fight in armor on horseback. If you've ever watched the sport, you've seen that big kind of barrel-shaped thing that they're leaping over. It's called a vaulting horse, and it's called a vaulting horse for a reason. It used to be an actual horse, and those two loops that are attached to the top of it are based on the front and back of a medieval knight's saddle. So, the knight has to be extremely well trained, and his equipment also evolves to reflect the realities of armored combat. If you look at a number of the weapons that are on display in the exhibition, you'll see they've got this diamond-shaped cross-section in the blade, and that is precisely because the blade needs to have a kind of robustness in order to take the punishment that's involved in armored combat, much rougher on a sword than unarmored combat. And ordinary foot soldiers' equipment evolves too. Halberds, like the one that you'll see in the gallery, are a weapon that takes shape in the 1300s, originally in Switzerland, and it is a way for essentially Swiss peasants to get a little bit of additional power against the Austrian knights from whom they're trying to win their independence. And so this is essentially kind of a Swiss Army knife for a knight. Well, for somebody who's fighting a knight. It's you know, a big, robust chopping blade, a long, robust stabbing point for getting into the gaps between armor, and that chopping beak, piercing beak that's actually designed to pierce plate armor in the back. And a large body of well-disciplined and well-motivated Switzers carrying something like this halberd are capable of defeating Austrian knights as they do, and as their equivalent counterparts do in Flanders, in Scotland, around the same time, and from the late 1200s into the 1400s. Infantry tactics are evolving in ways that are really taking some of the power away from the knights. And indeed, the evolution of armor, the development of plate armor, may have been part of the knight's strategy to gain back some of that power, but it was ultimately going to be a losing battle. Porcupine formations of foot soldiers with long spears or halberds, like I showed you, are really effective at stopping charging knights in their tracks. And if they're supported by crossbows, these knights are kind of sitting ducks. And you may notice in this image here, those are indeed firearms, which I think most people would be surprised to realize firearms appear on the battlefield at almost exactly the same time as plate armor, kind of on the same timeline. Firearms aren't as effective as early, but by the 1400s, cannons are capable of knocking down high stone walls of castles, and by the 1500s, handheld firearms are capable of piercing plate armor, and the game is rapidly changing. But interestingly, even at the time when the knights are kind of losing their battlefield advantage relative to foot soldiers and relative particularly to handheld firearms, the craft of armor making is really at its technical apex. This suit of Maximilian armor that is on display here is an extraordinary tour de force of the metalworker's art. I've done just enough metalworking to realize how hard it is even to take a flat sheet of steel and to shape it into a simple dome, let alone to take flat sheet of steel and to shape it into the really weird, complex shape of a human calf. And then add on to that all the rippling and the turned edges and such that's done with this quite heavy steel. And I often liken the craft of armor making to trying to fold a steel-fitted bed sheet. You know, when you try to do bed sheet, it never goes right the first time. You have to do it over and over again. Except with steel, you don't get a second chance. If you do not get everything exactly right the first time, there's no going back, because you're coaxing these little atoms of iron to go into the right direction. And once it's gone into the wrong direction, there's really kind of no bringing it back. It is extraordinary to be able to deliver something like this. And it is, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's very much along the lines of an imitation of contemporary fashion. If you compare this suit of armor to the woodcut of these Swiss soldiers of the rough period, of the same period, you can really see the connections here. The richly gathered fabrics covering the body, the square-cut neckline, the broad-toed shoes, even the fact that the lower legs are covered with smooth silk stockings. All of that is echoed in the design of the suit of armor itself. So essentially trying to recreate the look of fabric in steel, turning the hardest of materials into something that imitates the softest. Maximilian armor is named for the Emperor Maximilian, who was the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, essentially kind of Germany plus Austria at about this time. We don't know whether Maximilian was really involved in the development of the style, but he was certainly quite involved in armor, as indeed any important military leader, indeed any knight, would be at the time. They needed to know a lot about the making of armor, who was good at making it, what you wanted in a good suit, because your life ultimately could depend on it. So Maximilian actually spent a good deal of his time with his armors, becoming familiar with the craft. And this woodcut, showing him visiting one of his armor workshops, gives you a good idea of everything that kind of goes into the craft of armor making. An armor maker had to have this wide variety of different shaped hammers, anvils, and stakes, kind of the uprights that you see there, for example, that would slot into the anvil. Just these different kinds of shapes to get the complexity of forms that are required for a suit of armor that's going to work properly with the human body. You can imagine this is a pretty high capital undertaking. You've also got to get the various kinds of furnaces available to you. And this is one of the reasons why armor making tended to run in families. A son would inherit the craft from his father, would inherit the shop, the clientele, and of course would also be raised to the craft from a very young age, just as the knight was raised to the craft of being a knight in that sort of apprenticeship system. And this is actually one of my favorite objects in the show. It's a fairly utilitarian kind of munitions grade object, as we might describe it today. Not a super fancy helmet, something that would be made in mass quantities for ordinary foot soldiers. And it shows a bit of how the process of armoring worked. You start with a flat sheet of steel. You use the big shears to cut it to the shape that you want, and then you use this succession of hammers and anvils and stakes to rough out the shape. Once you have the shape in place, then you start to use a succession of lighter and lighter hammers, because hammers, of course, leave marks on the metal, and the ultimate goal is to have a piece of armor that looks like it's never actually been touched by human hands. It somehow magically appeared in the form that it has. And one of the things I really love about this object is that you can actually, this one was not taken through those later stages of finishing that removed the hammer marks. You can still see the signs of how it was worked, but it's far enough. It's been brought far enough along in that finishing process that dimpled surface is really quite aesthetic in its own right. And the surface has also been heat treated to give it a sort of brownish tint. Looks really lovely. Also helps protect the object from rust. As you can imagine, a big concern with steel armor. And and the Hans Herberger, the armor maker who produced this helmet, would have done, just basically kind of churned these things out in mass quantities. It's done from a single sheet of steel, I'll point out. Later helmets were sometimes crafted from two separate to get and then kind of welded together. Much easier to do that. But this whole thing was just one single flat sheet of steel raised up even with the brim and all of those shapes. It's just kind of mind-blowing. And this was kind of the bargain basement version of the day, and it's gorgeous. It's really absolutely a beautiful thing in its own right. And this was also one of the most industrialized processes of its day. The sheets of steel were actually produced using water-powered trip hammers, very heavy hammers that would kind of pound these bars of iron stock into flat sheet. You can see an example of that in a huge graphic that's up in the armor-making section of the exhibition. And then at the final stages, the grinding, polishing, buffing, and so on was done again at water-powered wheels. So this was a period of actually quite a lot of technological innovation within the framework of what was really available to them at the time. And nowhere is that better exemplified than in this pistol shield that's in the exhibition. This was produced for Henry VIII. There's quite a number of these that survived, not a huge number, but a significant number. We're very lucky to have one of them in the Higgins collection. They mostly were preserved either in the Tower of London or in the waters off of Southampton, where the Henry VIII's flagship, the Mary Rose, went down. They were issued to some of the troops on board that ship, but also probably to Henry VIII's honor guard in London. Probably more popular with the honor guard than with the troops who were actually expected to use them in a combat. The pistol shield is just not a very practical item. Pistol is a great thing to have in a battle. A shield is a great thing to have in a battle. They're just not two flavors that were meant to go together. Most notably, if you look at this in the exhibition, you can actually see the back of it. You can see how this pistol is loaded from the back, which you kind of has to be, because otherwise it defeats the purpose of it being a shield. So a firearm that loads from the back, we call it a breech loader, technically. And breech loading weapons didn't come really into common use until the mid-1800s. And there's a good reason for that. The machining technology wasn't sufficiently precise in the 1500s to get a really good seal. And if the seal isn't perfect, then it's kind of luck of the draw whether the explosion kind of fires out the front or fires out the back. So hence, I think they must have looked really impressive in the hands of the honor guard, but not necessarily so popular with anybody who might have had to use it in an actual fight. But even if the pistol shield was a bit of a technological dead end, firearms were very much starting to dominate the battlefield by the latter half of the 1500s. And you can start to see this in the design of armor, the technical expertise and skill and the effort that goes into making the armor starts to get scaled back in the latter part of the 1500s. The decorative effects that you see in the armor come less and less from the metal and more from the surface decoration. So they're not necessarily hammered into the steel, they're etched into its surface, as in the example of this fabulous armor from northern Italy, where the shapes of the steel, the shapes of the plates are simpler than they were in the Maximilian example, but the surface is very richly decorated with etching, highlighted with gold, and then tinted with a heat treatment to give this sort of kind of a feel of ancient Rome. And indeed, that's very much the sort of look that they're going for, with the motifs that evoke Poseidon and Athena and Jupiter, and also at the same time suggesting the cut velvet silks that were silk velvets that were patterned velvets that were part of a gentleman's wardrobe, the basis of the look of the late 1500s. So still very much imitating the look of the of civilian garments of the day. And I've been putting the weights on here. You'll also see the weights on the labels, but you see they're typically in the 40 to 60 pound range with the suits that we've seen up till now. And then compare it to the weight on this siege breastplate. 24 pounds just for the breastplate. That's half the weight of the suit of about the same period that you just saw. And that gives you an idea of why firearms are going to spell the end of plate armor. To make plate armor that's going to stop a bullet, you have to make it so heavy that it's just punishing to wear. You can still wear it in siege operations, so a breastplate like this, it's going to be worn in a besieged city or in the trench works around the city. You're not really marching around in this thing. You're wearing it to go into the trenches, to kind of scope out the territory or whatever, to operate the siege weapons and such. But then you're not going to be walking very far in it. And you can also see the marks in the photograph, and even have a look in the exhibition. You can see that this is an object that saved the wearer's life multiple times. There are multiple bullet marks on it. And yet even so, even though this is a very utilitarian, very simple kind of low-end armor of its day, it's still got the aesthetic features. The kind of the shaping of the doublet of a man's civilian jacket of the day, even those incised lines down the front and kind of from the armpit to the belly button. That's the same place where you would have decorative trim on a man's jacket. In fact, these are the places where there are seams on the garment that would be covered with the trim, and it's again echoed in the steel. So armor is really fast losing the arms race by the late 1500s, but it still has tremendous power over the imaginations of European culture. And nowhere can you see this better than in this jousting armor in the exhibition. From the late 1500s, but essentially based on a field armor, a battlefield armor of the late Middle Ages, of the 1400s. In fact, if you look at the shape of the helmet in this suit and compare it to this late 1400s helmet, you can see the similarity in design. And essentially, the suit is based on a late medieval form of jousting called the joust of war, where you're basically wearing a normal battlefield armor, but you're putting a few reinforcing plates in particular places to give extra protection to the body where you need it. Jousters pass each other left side to left side, so you're typically putting extra defenses onto the left side of your body. So, for example, this shoulder plate that's in the exhibition would have been bolted to the left shoulder to give that extra protection on the left side of the body. And you can see these features on the suit, on the Rennzeug in the exhibition, that all of that extra protection added onto the left-hand side a very restrictive form of armor. If you look at it, you'll see that the helmet doesn't actually turn left and right. So this guy can't really look left and right. This is not the kind of suit that you can wear in battle. It's specialized for the controlled circumstances of the joust. And the joust, you know who's going to attack you, when, where, from what direction. It's all very controlled. And so you can sacrifice the versatility, the mobility, and so on for the sake of extra protection. And if you look at the weight of this suit, you can also see another way in which mobility has been sacrificed for the sake of protection. It weighs twice as much as a field armor of the period. One of the things I'd really love to do with the collection is to kind of show it in person, do gallery tours. I kind of like it much better than the PowerPoint, especially after a few years of COVID. You know, the digital media kind of grow a little bit old. But one of the great things about presenting in this format is I can show you some things with the armor that I couldn't actually show you in the gallery. For example, the inside view of the of a suit of armor. In fact, somebody earlier this evening was asking quite intelligently about what would be inside the suit, because he imagined that without some kind of padding, a helmet wouldn't necessarily be all that much to you. And he was indeed quite right. The padding rarely survives, because you can imagine that you are fighting in this stuff, you're sweating in this stuff, and it's made of leather and fabric and horsehair and things like that. It just doesn't typically last very well. But this is an example where we actually do have original lining, probably not the original lining, not from the late 1500s, but this suit was in use for a really long time, and this lining probably does indeed come from the working life of the suit. It's really made in a very workmanlike kind of fashion. So the helmet is padded and lined. You can see inside the chin as well, another place where you can imagine that there could be a certain amount of discomfort from the impact if you don't have some cushioning. And here's a nice close-up. People often ask what the little kind of hooks and latches and tabs and stuff are on the outside of the helmet on this. On the outside of this helmet, if you haven't seen it already, it's got a little sort of dangling piece of leather, not the original, but that replacing what would have been the original. That the strip of leather connects to this sliding bolt, so that if you pull on the tab on the outside, it pulls the sliding bolt against the spring, releasing the catch so that you can open up this little door on the faceplate to get a little bit of fresh air. Fighting in armor, lack of oxygen is a big issue, as you can imagine, and heat, and also perhaps get a little bit of water or something, and just to be able to talk to your ground crew, because this is not something that you can fight in without a couple of people to help you in and out of it. You can't even put it on by yourself. And this suit was still in use as late as the early 1700s. Herr Generalleutnant von Bose was a courtier at the Dresden court in the early 1700s, and had his, there's a whole series of these armors that survived, that were preserved in Dresden at the electoral court of Saxony in Dresden. And the names of the owners are written inside inside the armor for easy identification. So if you thought your mom invented that for when you were going to primary school, actually no, it has quite a long history. And yet this, and it's kind of amazing to think this suit was being actively used into the early 1700s. So that practice of jousting, it had a long life. Long after, the armor was not being worn by this time for practical purposes, and the skills of using a lance on horseback was not part of the battlefield combat. And one of the things I really loved in the exhibition is this print of Oglethorpe, and which I definitely had to share as part of the mix. And Oglethorpe would never have worn a suit of armor in his life. certainly not on the battlefield. But it's still a part of portraiture into the early 1800s, kind of associating Oglethorpe with the knights of legend, with that kind of heroic and mythic past. But even in the Middle Ages, as early as the Middle Ages, when a knight puts on his suit of armor, particularly going into a tournament or jousting context, he's thinking of King Arthur. In fact, they did play acting around the Knights of the Round Table as early as the days of the Black Prince. I didn't get his image into the slideshow I wanted to, but there was just too much going on today. But that's a really great 19th century, highly researched and really well executed image of 14th century armor. The story I've been telling about European armor could also be told about armor from other parts of the world. This helmet in the form of a sea conch shell is one of the absolute star objects in the Higgins collection. It's actually dated on the inside, which is very unusual to know when it was made, also the name of the maker as well in the inscription. And it's just a tour de force of metalworking. This particular piece is not really battle-worthy. The work that it takes to you really have to thin out the metal, tease it into the spikes of the conch shell, and so it's not really capable of taking a real battlefield use. But this would certainly have been worn on the heads of one of the most important men in Japan in its day. The helmet was actually greatly admired. In its day, there are imitations actually out there, one in a shrine in Japan, another one's at the Met, made later on in the 1600s. This is the original and the finest of them, and it was in use for a long time. If you look around the neck here, these holes are used to attach the neck guard, and they're kind of higgledy-piggledy. There seems like there's no rhyme or reason to the holes, and that's because there's multiple schemes of holes superimposed upon each other. Over time, the styling with which these laced neck guards were attached to the helmet changed, and so as the fashions changed, the helmet was adapted to it. So we know that it was used for a good long period of time. The same could be said as of that mail coat that I showed you earlier, which started off as military gear in Europe around 1500 or so, was probably sold off perhaps to the Ottoman Empire as mail went out of use in Europe, ultimately probably ended up its working life in North Africa in the late 1800s, where the soldiers who went up took part in the uprising against British colonial rule in the Sudan in the 1880s and 90s, would wear the mail coats and helmets like the one you see here, armed with swords and spears, going up against the modernizing weapons of the British of the time. This equipment brought them in there. It really, for the people who wore it, it evoked the days of Muhammad himself. In fact, indeed, the equipment that they carried in a lot of ways wasn't all that unlike the things that were being worn by Muhammad and his followers during those early conquests in the 600s and the 700s. But as you can imagine, did not fare well against the early machine guns that the British were deploying. But in case you think that that is just a thing that the Africans might have been doing at the time, by way of reminder, here are French troops leaving for the trenches, or leaving for the battlefront of World War I in 1914, equipped with helmets and breastplates. For the most part, body armor had gone out of use some centuries earlier, but there are few specialized types of heavy cavalry as well as armor for siege operations that are still being used into the early 1900s. And we've got an example. Actually, I think this example didn't make it into the show. And I didn't make that connection. But you can still see these things being worn by honor guards today. Obviously, they didn't really survive very long into the trench warfare of World War I. But interestingly, as the absolute death knell of these traditional forms of battlefield armor was being sounded, a new age of armor was beginning. During the early part of the war, the American army was looking at the situation in Europe, realizing that there was a very high likelihood that America would get dragged into this conflict. And they realized that American troops were going to need helmets for the new kinds of warfare that were being fought in the trenches. They needed head protection against the kind of shrapnel, the artillery barrages that were happening in the trenches of France and Flanders. They looked at the situation in America, tried to figure out who in America could help them develop helmets for the 20th century. And they turned to pretty much the only expert in the field in America at the time. Dr. Bashford Dean was the curator of arms and armor at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so they commissioned him into the army and put him in charge of a project to reinvent the helmet for the 20th century. Dean used his knowledge of the medieval historical helmets to come up with his design. And interestingly, although the American troops ultimately got issued with the same sort of very kind of cheesy, ineffective, or much less effective kind of Tommy helmets that the British were wearing, largely for economic considerations. The design of Dean's Model 5 that you see here has a lot in common with what American troops are issued today, and it's pretty standard in a lot of armies. So he was well ahead of his time. And the issue, of course, was reproducibility. It had to be not only effective, but it had to be something that could be produced at scale and economically. And that wasn't a question Dean could answer himself. He needed to bring in industry experts. And that's where John Woodman Higgins comes into the story. Higgins was a steel industrialist in Worcester. His factory specialized in taking plate steel and stamping it into various shapes for various kinds of commercial and military purposes. And so Higgins was brought into this project. He was and I think that helmet didn't make it into the, so sad, so heartbreaking. But you'll have to come see it when both of those will be on display at the in Worcester in a few years. Higgins was brought in as a consultant. Higgins had been set up in the industry by his father in the early 1900s, creating the Worcester Press Steel Factory. But he also had a boyhood interest in armor. He loved stories of knights and so on. He actually chose a knight in armor as the logo for the Worcester Press Steel Company. And he decided in the late 1920s that he would create a museum of metalcraft on the grounds of his factory. And he would use the opportunity to be able to indulge his passion for knights. And the jewel in the crown of his museum was going to be 100 suits of steel armor. And the construction began in around 1930. The museum opened in 1931. The Higgins Armory, John Woodman Higgins Armory Museum, on the outside was a splendid glass and steel, kind of quite innovative structure of its day. And on the inside, the Great Hall was divided into two wings, one devoted to modern examples of metalworking, artistry and craft and industry, and then the other featuring the 100 steel knights that were really the prized possession of the Higgins collection. And to give you a bit of an idea of the journeys that these objects took. That Maximilian suit that's in the exhibition is actually particularly well documented. We've got a photograph of it dating as well, over 100 years old when it was in the Schiller collection in Germany. It went to the U.S., where it was on display at the Chicago World's Fair, ultimately purchased by Oliver Belmont, ended up in Newport, Rhode Island, at Belmont's mansion, which is now owned by the entrepreneur of the woman who created Alex and Annie jewelry. After Belmont's death, it was purchased by Clarence Mackey, and then ultimately by John William Higgins in 1940, where it could ultimately be sketched by Norman Rockwell in this fabulous image inspired by the Higgins Armory Museum, and kind of the feature armor in this is in the exhibition, and also I think you reproduced the sketch as well. It, as you might expect, became a cover for the Saturday Evening Post in 1962. So the Higgins Armory continued active until 2013, but in the wake of the economic downturns, it just wasn't really really sustainable, and so the collection moved to the Worcester Art Museum in 2014. I moved with it. I'd been with the Higgins collection since 1999, and we currently have about 100 objects from the collection on display, and we're working to develop a permanent gallery which will display substantially the entirety of the collection, upwards of 1,000 objects in all. But for the time being, a very large part of the collection was in storage, and that was part of why why I in particular really wanted to make this exhibition happen. It was such a shame to have such star objects, such amazing works of human ingenuity, creativity, and craftsmanship lying in the darkness of storage. And so it's tremendous to be able to share them with you, and it's been tremendous to be able to share them with you this evening. And thank you very much.